We're gonna go over all the muscles that you use when you're doing a snatch or a clean and jerk, and we're gonna start right now. So when we're training athletes or we're training weightlifters, a lot of the individual athletes will say, well, what muscles am I really training right now? How can I actually get stronger? And then as a coach, we should be sitting there going, okay, we see a specific movement pattern happen or a consistent movement pattern occur, and we should be able to look at that movement pattern and deduce based off that movement pattern that this individual might be a little bit weaker with a specific muscle or muscle group. And if we increase and isolate those muscle groups, we can then in turn improve their technique or improve their overall execution of the exercise. So a lot of this comes into play, but we have to actually know what muscles are we using. And so if we can break it down into the pull to the knee into the hip, and then the hip into the catch, and that would be for the snatch or the clean. And then as we're talking about standing up that clean, we need to focus on the muscles used when we're actually gonna be standing up the weight, and then also what muscles will be used when we're doing the dip and drive and the jerk, and then also when we're holding overhead. So let's start with specifically the snatch and the clean on that first pull. So pulling the bar to the knee. So as we're getting set at liftoff, one of the big factors is that we have to be aware of what our body's doing. We have to set tension. If we can set tension, then as we apply that energy into the bar, ideally we'll be able to keep that bar as close as possible. That's the name of the game. Okay, and I believe to keep the bar as close as possible, we want to think about pushing the knees back. Okay, so the knees should come back off the floor, and as the chest rises, it'll rise a little bit quicker than the hips, so the chest will stay ahead of the hips. So as we get set to pull off the floor, we should set the bar with our lats, which will also mean a little bit of our rhomboids, okay? A little bit of our posterior delt. That's what we're gonna really be thinking about right off the floor. Lats, posterior delt, and the rhomboids. And then as we pull to the knee, when we're looking at the actual legs, we're gonna see the knee joint tends to lengthen. Okay, so the knee joint will lengthen a little bit, which means that it's going to start to extend slightly. Okay, so this is gonna put a lot of load on the hamstrings, on the glutes, especially off the floor if we're driving through the heels. Typically we will be holding that flat foot position. And then as that chest is coming up, that's gonna put a lot of tension on the lower back or the erector spinae, so the iliocostalis, the spinalis, the longissimus, and also on the QL and the piriformis. Okay, so we're really looking at right off the floor, hamstrings, glutes, lower back, the erector spinae really, and the QL, the piriformis, and setting that upper body with the lats, posterior delts, and the rhomboids. Now, we will be using a bit of our quads. It won't be as lit up yet. If we keep our knees forward off the floor, our quads will be a little bit more dominant, but we really aren't targeting the quads yet. Now, as the bar passes through what we refer to as no man's land, okay? As the bar gets around the knees, which is where most lifts are lost. So as we're going from the below the knee to the hip, this is really gonna be that second pull, but a lot of lifts are lost in that no man's land from below the knee to just above the knee. So what ideally would happen with perfect technique is that as the bar goes around the knees will clear back so they're right over top of the heels, and then as the bar comes over top of the kneecap, the knees will come under. When that happens, there's gonna be a co-contraction around the knee joint to maintain stability, and that's when the quads are really gonna start to light up. Okay, and ideally we're gonna hold that flat foot. So by holding that flat foot, we're still applying pressure from the glutes and the hamstrings, okay, but we're also starting to use the quads quite a bit more. The key concept here is that the hips will start to come forward. And if we look at a technical model like Quo, okay, we're gonna see the hips start to come under the upper body as the bar gets into the hip. And the timing will be a little bit different between the snatch and the clean, but it's the same basic principle. At this point now, we're gonna really start to feel the hips extend. So hip extension is occurring mainly from the hamstrings, okay, and the glutes, and maybe very, very slightly from our groin area, from our adductors. But in all reality, it's gonna be mostly from the hamstrings and from the glutes, okay? That's why weightlifters have very strong and powerful glutes and large, hypertrophic glutes. At this point, most lifters, not all of them, but some of them will still have a little bit of knee flexion. Okay, so it goes the hips through and then the knees extend. That's when we're really gonna be hammering the quads. In world-class lifters, it's basically happening at the same time, where we're gonna have the hips come through, the knees will extend, and then we come vertical. So during that time frame, most of the upper body actions with muscles are gonna still be the lats, the posterior delt, the rhomboids, even to a point what we're doing, what we're holding with the erector spinae, and some of those really small muscles in there as well. But then what happens is that as the bar comes off of the hip, that's when we start to see more action from the upper body. So in all reality, coming off the floor, it's gonna be predominantly hamstrings, lower back, and a little bit of glutes as we drive up. Quads very slightly. But then as we pass the knee, the quads are gonna light up quite a bit, and we're gonna start to extend those hips through as the bar gets into the hip. Okay, so that's where we start to see hamstrings, the glutes really come into play. This is why people who are also really good at jumping tend to have really, really strong and explosive hamstrings. Okay, because they're able to hip extend very, very well. Now, when the bar comes off the hip, this is where it's gonna be a little bit different from the snatch to the clean. The leg muscles are essentially the same. The rate of coordination, that twitch force, is gonna be very, very similar. The benefit of weightlifting is that it's happening at such a high speed, we learn how to coordinate really, really well. In the snatch, what we're gonna see is there's gonna be a tremendous amount of, what people refer to as stabilizer muscles. We're training our stabilizer muscles, okay? So that's basically training like our trunk and holding that bar overhead. So when we're holding that bar overhead, one of the cues that I like to use is actually bending the bar in half. When we think about that and we just do this, now we're really gonna feel our rhomboid, okay? Our posterior delt, our tricep on the lockout, our anterior delt, okay? Our traps, all of these muscles are gonna be used. And the traps will also be really used on the finish of the snatch and on the finish of the clean with the upper body. So now we're starting to see as the bar comes off the hips, okay, we're gonna see a little bit of elbow flexion. So the bicep will have a little bit of play. We're gonna see a quick elbow extension on the lockout in the snatch. That will be the tricep. We need to be stable in our shoulder girdle and sink the scaps down. That's mainly the rhomboid. Yes, there's a couple other little muscles around that area that will also play a big time role, and the traps play a monster role as well, especially on that big shrug. With the clean, what we're gonna see is a big shrug from the traps and a lot of work from the lats as the elbows wrap around. Okay, so the lats do play a role in how the elbows come around the bar. So that's what we're looking at with the upper body in that position. And then finally, as we stand up and we absorb that big heavy clean, and as we catch that big snatch overhead, we need to focus on trunk control. So when we're thinking about trunk control, we're gonna have the rectus abdominis, the transverse abdominis, our obliques, so that we're not rotating all over the place. We need to be as stable as possible. So that's where that dynamic trunk control comes into play. That's gonna help us, especially in the front squat. When we catch a clean in that full front squat position, we really need to be super stable with our entire back. We need to be very stable in our trunk, and we also need to be able to recruit heavily from our quads to stand that up, okay? Typically, when we look at something like a back squat, okay, the back squat strength that we're gonna gain is gonna transfer to a better pull. The front squat's gonna transfer better to catching that clean, but also probably to the dip and drive on the jerk, and that's where we're gonna go next. So as you stand up a snatch, as you stand up a clean, it's really focusing on a good, strong trunk and really, really strong erectors. And then that's gonna take us into, now we're finished with the snatch, we get into the dip and drive and the jerk. When we dip, we wanna see the hips come back very, very slightly, very slightly. Mainly it's gonna be almost entirely vertical with the hips slightly back if we have someone who has really, really active hips, okay? We wanna see knees go forward while the trunk stays super vertical. Okay, if the knees come forward, that's gonna load our quads. But we also know when we finish the drive that our quads will extend the knee joint, and we also know that the hips will extend. So we know there's some co-contraction there where the hamstrings will get loaded a little bit on the eccentric, as are the quads. We also need to train our upper back tremendously well to prevent any forward lean. Okay, if we have forward lean, then we're gonna drive the bar forward. So we need to be as stable and doing things like very slow eccentric back squats, or even round back and then arch back glute hams is gonna play a major role in holding that posture really well. So being able to have a very vertical dip and drive is gonna come back to strong quads, strong hamstrings, and a really, really strong back. And that's mainly gonna be the erectors at this point. Then as we get into that drive and we catch in that split position, now we're going back to the same muscle groups, a lot of the traps, a lot of the deltoids, a lot of the triceps overhead, and being able to hold and squeeze that lockout position. Okay, those are all done in an isometric manner. So if we can do isometrics at high speeds, that can pay off to our lockout. And when we're in that position, now we're really gonna be triggering the adductors and the abductors depending upon where we're at in the split. And then as we recover, the adductors come back together while being stable overhead. Okay, so it really is gonna come down to each position's different, but in all reality, training from the floor to the knee, really focus on lower back positioning and hamstrings. From the knee to the hip, quads and hamstrings and glutes and lower back, setting the bar with good strong lats, rhomboids, traps a bit. Off the hip, upper body focus is gonna be traps, posterior delts, anterior delts for the snatch as well, triceps, even a little bit of biceps, okay? And then catching in that overhead position or catching in the split. Same thing, we wanna focus on having a strong shoulder position overhead. So all of these lifts are gonna be very, very similar, but done in a very precise manner. One of the key factors that you can do is look at the movement that you're executing, try to figure out where you're at individually, okay? Where are my problems? Where are my errors occurring? And then you might be able to train specific ways to increase or to get rid of those errors based off of weaknesses that you might have in your overall kinetic chain. And that's exactly what we do inside of all of our weightlifting products. If you head over to GarageStrength.com, you can pick up a Garage Strength weightlifting program to help you hit some monster PRs. Because remember, freaks, if you want to become a champion, you've always got to cultivate your power. Peace.